Hey guys, welcome back to State of the Nation. Andrew here, and let's talk about the Public Health Response Bill and the budget. Alright, so we've got here the New Zealand Parliament website. We can see the Public Health Response Bill, I should say. Now, there's been a whole lot of discussion about this in the last couple of days because, well, the government shoved it through in record time. Now, some people are defending this bill, and the defence tends to revolve around talking about how the powers from Level 3 and Level 4 are about the same thing as what this bill does anyway, so nothing has really changed. That seems to be the crux of what people are trying to say. Now, firstly, that completely ignores the fact that this was shoved through in a record amount of time without following any of our democratic process, which is something the government is making a pretty terrible habit out of. And secondly, it actually goes further because it allows the appointment of civilian enforcement officers, and that can be a problem. So talking about the timing, the bill was introduced 12th of May. At 2 p.m. when the House opened, and by 6 p.m. on the 13th, it was law. They skipped the select committee. They didn't do any of the regulatory impact analysis that Treasury normally does, because if we look at this next tab, we can see the government had suspended that financial oversight. So now anything to do with pandemic response doesn't need any kind of RIA done for it. So that was pretty terrible in its own right. It caused a little bit of a stink, and now we've been seeing a big case where that has come into effect because this has had no real chance for discussion or analysis. Effectively, what's happened is a small group of MPs have put this law together and they've said, right, that is the law now, end of story. If you don't like it, too bad. Which, that sounds awfully dictatory and not really the open democracy that we're supposed to have. But I mean, some people will say that, oh look, it's unprecedented times, it's urgent, you have to do it. But no, not really. There is plenty of time to even expand this out to maybe a week. There would not have been a problem if they'd done this a week earlier. But what we saw was, in a really, really short space of time, just edicts coming out saying this is the law. Tough. And it's a continuation of what we started to see last year from this government, and they're really taking that to heart and thinking that they can get away with just about anything because people love Jacinda. So many people think she's doing such a fantastic job because we crushed that curve that they have got their blinkers on and they're not looking at everything else that is going around. So in record time, they've shoved this bill through, and they've actually gone back and said, let's do a select committee now to try and appease the people. It's clearly a token gesture. Nothing will change, and they will continue just pumping out laws as they see fit, and they're just going to do whatever they like. And once you get used to that kind of power, then, well, it kind of corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as we all know. So we don't want a government that is going to be just pushing things through that they think are correct without any kind of oversight, but that seems to be the sort of direction that we're heading. Now, the second aspect was actually in the contents of the bill, which all the defenders kind of skip over this bit, and that's the civilian enforcers. So in addition to the police now being able to enter your home and just come on in without a warrant because they suspect something, it's pretty loosely defined, it just has to be something that they can say is a health risk of some kind, then they can just come on into your house and do whatever they like, and who knows what, remove children if they think they need to have them tested or treated or whatever. So there's some really wacky stuff going on with that, but worse than that, they've allowed them to create civilian enforcement officers. So these are just regular people. They get a piece of paper that says you're now an enforcer, and you can go into any business. I don't think you can go into a person's home, but you can go into a business or a club or whatever, and you can shut it down. You have a pretty big power over people just because you've got this piece of paper from the government. Now that sounds an awful lot like some civilian enforcement gangs and groups that we've seen in the past, and that's never ended well. Now, of course, they promise us that they won't abuse the power, but I mean, once people get a taste of power and they can lord it over others, it's fairly addictive. If you haven't seen the prison experiment, I think it was Harvard, go and check that out, because it is really interesting what happens to people when they get some power over others and how that changes a person. So by allowing for the possibility of this to happen, the government's really sending us in the wrong direction. It's really important not to create an environment in which this stuff can happen, even if you promise that it won't happen. So that is quite dangerous. And I don't like the direction that it is heading. And we could see some bad stuff. And not necessarily, but it is a precursor. Every time that the kind of Gestapo type bad stuff has been happening around the world in the last 70 years, that has been as a result of these enforcement groups going unchecked. So we have to be super, super careful, and just allowing the possibility for that, that's a really bad place to be. Alright, the next thing is leading up into all of this, talking about the response and the budget. We've got this column here from Steve Ellis. Now, this is pretty much the only column on Stuff which is critical of the Prime Minister, because Stuff tends to be very, very supportive of the Prime Minister and her ideologies. But this is the guy that wrote the article slightly criticising Jacinda's response, and what happened was Jacinda's office called Stuff and they added a clarification to the bottom, which was the first and quite dangerous sort of case of blatant political interference in the media, and it just happened to come after a $50 million bailout, so a lot of people are questioning what is actually going on there. Anyway, Steve Ellis is a little bit more critical, and he's talking in this article about what is behind the Prime Minister and her motives, because we had a case of her being the president of the International Union of Socialist Youth back when the global financial crisis was going on. And there's a video of her around using the word comrade many, many times. And in this article, Steve Ellis basically is talking about her response to that back in the day, in 2008, was wealth redistribution. That was effectively what they saw as the solution to the financial crisis. Now, yes, so some financial institutions are kind of corrupt, but the socialist answer of wealth redistribution always goes badly, without exception. It just doesn't work. And so Steve Ellis is talking about, well, maybe it's quite likely, actually, that Jacinda hasn't really changed too much, and that, well, there's a very real possibility that she'll use the coming financial crisis as a vehicle for instituting some of this wealth redistribution that she would like to see. So he's just giving us a warning about that, and we haven't had any clarifications or anything added to this article yet, but it is important to understand that that is part of where the Prime Minister comes from and where she would probably like us to end up, and it never ever ends well. It's nice in theory, but it just doesn't work when it comes to reality. Okay, so we're talking about the budget as well. Now, this budget, the government is to borrow an extra $50 billion. Okay, so it's not necessarily borrowing. The government, a large part of that is going to come from government bonds. So the government issues a bond, the Reserve Bank or other banks buy those bonds, and that gives money to the government, and they then spend that as part of government spending. Now, in the case of the Reserve Bank, they will literally print that money, print that currency, and give it to the government. So it is just introducing that much new currency into our system, and $50 billion, that is an awful lot. The Labour government already has a track record of overspending. So for the last couple of budgets, we've seen an extra sort of $10 billion. So the last budget got up to, I think, $111 billion was the budgeted amount for the government spend for the year. And so to put that in perspective, another $50 billion is absolutely huge. Now, when you talk about huge debt, often the United States comes up because they're in a really bad place right now. Now, they're talking about $6 trillion worth of stimulus. But if you put it into perspective with the size of their GDP, our borrowing of an extra $60 billion, or I think it was $60 billion worth of bonds over a couple of years, that it is actually really, really significant. I don't think people have really talked about this too much, but the government is going to be borrowing an extra $50 billion, and a lot of that is coming from bonds. Here we go. There is bonds set at $60 billion versus the $10 billion forecast. So there's a whole lot of extra extra currency coming. And we can see that, there we go, $60 billion for the bond program. So there's a whole lot of money. And unfortunately, what tends to happen with the Labour government is that all of that money is going to be used as central planning, because they think they know how to best save us from this financial crisis. So they will sit back in the beehive and they will come up with these wonderfully huge spending government programs to try and do this wealth redistribution and spend and spend and spend and try and create jobs. And it won't work because they don't know what they're doing. We saw it with KiwiBuild. It was an absolute failure because they had the arrogance to think that they could do it better than companies who've been doing it for 100 years. So they'll do the same thing as with KiwiBuild, but just magnified out to $60 billion or $100 billion worth of spend, and it is going to go really badly. It's going to create hardly any jobs. It's going to fail because they just don't know what they're doing. The real opportunity to get out of this is for the government to get out of the way, to reduce the amount of taxes and spending that it does, and let people get on with figuring out solutions. So instead of 50 people in the beehive trying to figure it out, we've got hundreds of thousands of Kiwis, smart Kiwis, trying to figure it out and working on the problem. So it's not going to go well at all if they try and centrally plan it, because that always fails. And the other thing that they're going to do with all of this new currency is devalue our current currency. So in terms of how much money there is in New Zealand, we've got a chart here going up to 2020-ish, and it's showing around about 200 billion US dollars worth. So that's about 330 billion New Zealand dollars is our M2 money supply, which is the cash that we have plus all of the bank accounts and easily spendable money. So everything that's easily spendable. So 330 billion is a rough figure for that. Now if you introduce an extra 60 billion or 50 billion on top of that, that's quite a serious percentage. And because we're not actually going to be producing more, we're probably going to be producing less, or definitely will be producing less in probably everything except agriculture. It's going to devalue the currency that we already have. So everyone with savings accounts, they will have lower purchasing power. We'll probably see some deflation on luxury goods, things that people don't need. Will probably deflate in price because there is a lack of demand and people are stopping spending because of such a financial shock. And we'll probably see the cost of essential goods, like food and everything like that, is going to probably go up in price, especially when the rest of the world is crying out for our food because they have supply chain issues, and that's going to increase the demand, increase the prices for our exporters. So A, we'll pay more at home because the export price is higher, and B, we might have lowered availability at home because it's all going off for those higher export prices as well. So it's not going to be particularly pretty, but at least the farmers will manage to have a lot of selling of what they produce. Everyone else that doesn't directly produce goods that people need, we're going to see quite a significant contraction in the economy around all of that stuff. And while people are losing their jobs, we really don't want to be seeing our currency devalued, but unfortunately that is going to be the case from just the sheer scale of all of this newly minted money that the government will be spending. Whoa, okay, that is about enough for now. We are at nearly 14 minutes, so I'm going to leave it there. If you like this video, like and subscribe, and all the rest of the standard YouTube garbage, and we'll just keep doing it this format for the near future, I think, because it is a lot faster to put together and hopefully a bit more informative for you guys as well. Alright, that is enough from me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.